Socrates, the philosopher who changed the way humanity thinks. Part 1. Athens before Socrates. In the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, Athens stood as the beating heart of the Greek world. The city had recently survived an existential threat that would have destroyed most civilizations. When the Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful force the world had ever seen, sent massive armies and fleets to conquer Greece, few believed the fractious Greek city-states could survive. Yet in 490 BC at Marathon, and again in 480 BC at Salamis, Greek forces achieved victories that seemed impossible. Athens, more than any other city, led the resistance and emerged from these wars not merely intact but transformed. The Persian Wars did more than preserve Greek independence. They ignited an extraordinary burst of confidence and creative energy in Athens. The city that had stood against the mightiest empire on earth now saw itself as the defender of freedom and the champion of a new way of organizing human society. Democracy, which had begun as an experiment just decades earlier under reformers like Cleisthenes, now became the defining feature of Athenian identity. Citizens gathered in the assembly to debate and vote on matters of war and peace, law and justice. For the first time in history, ordinary men without noble birth or inherited wealth could speak in public forums and shape the destiny of their community. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens entered what historians call its golden age. The wealth that flowed into the city from its empire and maritime trade funded an unprecedented cultural flowering. The Parthenon rose on the Acropolis, a temple of gleaming marble that proclaimed Athenian power and devotion to Athena. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides created tragedies that explored the deepest questions of human existence, fate, and moral responsibility. Crowds of thousands gathered in outdoor theaters to witness these dramas, which were not mere entertainment but civic rituals that examined the values and tensions of their society. Into this atmosphere of questioning and debate came a new kind of intellectual figure, the sophists. These traveling teachers moved from city to city offering instruction in rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. In a democracy where success depended on one's ability to sway the assembly or defend oneself in court, the sophists promised to teach the skills necessary for political and legal victory. Men like Protagoras and Gorgias attracted wealthy students willing to pay substantial fees for their instruction. They taught that truth was relative, that persuasive argument mattered more than objective facts, and that traditional beliefs about the gods and morality were mere conventions that varied from place to place. The sophists represented something genuinely new in Greek culture. Unlike the poets and traditional educators who taught established wisdom and religious stories, the sophists questioned everything. They analyzed language, examined the foundations of law and custom, and challenged their students to think critically about received traditions. Yet their approach also contained a troubling element. Many sophists seemed to care more about winning arguments than discovering truth. They appeared to teach that any position could be defended with sufficient cleverness, that justice was whatever the powerful declared it to be, and that the only real standard was self-interest. This intellectual ferment created the world into which Socrates would emerge. Athens had become a place where ideas could be debated openly, where traditional religious and moral certainties were subjected to rational scrutiny, and where the life of the mind was valued as highly as military prowess or athletic achievement. The same democratic culture that gave citizens freedom to speak and think also created tensions between old and new values, between traditional piety and rational inquiry, between collective wisdom and individual questioning. The city that prided itself on free speech would one day execute its greatest philosopher for exercising that very freedom. Sources used: Socrates by Robin Waterfield, pages 128, The Cambridge Companion to Socrates, pages 834, A History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell, pages 80-91, The Oxford Classical Dictionary, 4th edition, entry on Sophists, pages 1394–1396, Part 2. The making of Socrates. Socrates was born in Athens around 470 BC, though the exact year remains uncertain. He came from what the ancient sources describe as relatively modest origins. His father, Socrates, worked as a stonemason or sculptor, a respectable craft but one that placed the family among working citizens rather than the aristocratic elite. His mother, Phaedo, worked as a midwife, a detail that Socrates himself would later use as a metaphor for his philosophical method of helping others give birth to ideas. The family possessed enough wealth to qualify Socrates for citizenship and military service, but they were not among the powerful families who dominated Athenian politics. The education Socrates received remains largely unknown. According to the conventions of his time and social class, he would have learned to read and write, studied poetry, particularly Homer, and received training in music and gymnastics. Some later sources claim he studied with various teachers, including the philosopher Aristophanes, but these accounts are difficult to verify. What seems clear is that Socrates possessed a sharp intelligence and a curiosity that went far beyond conventional education. Unlike the sophists who traveled widely, Socrates remained in Athens nearly his entire life, leaving only for military service. Socrates served with distinction in the Athenian army during the Peloponnesian War. Ancient sources, particularly Plato, record that he fought at Potidaea in 432 BC, at Delium in 424 BC, and at Amphipolis in 422 BC. At Potidaea, according to Plato's account in the Symposium, Socrates saved the life of the young Alcibiades during the retreat. At Delium, a serious Athenian defeat, witnesses reported that Socrates retreated calmly and courageously while others fled in panic. These military experiences reveal something important about the man who would become famous for intellectual pursuits. He possessed physical courage and could endure hardship without complaint. Ancient descriptions of Socrates' physical appearance emphasize his unusual, even ugly features. Multiple sources describe him as having bulging eyes, a flat nose, thick lips, and a potbelly. He walked barefoot even in winter, wore the same simple cloak in all weather, and seemed indifferent to physical comfort. This strange appearance became part of his identity. Aristophanes mocked him in the comedy Clouds, presenting Socrates as an eccentric natural philosopher who studied clouds and taught students to make weaker arguments defeat stronger ones. Though this portrayal was a caricature that bore little resemblance to the historical Socrates, it reveals that he was already a recognizable public figure in Athens by 423 BC, when the play was first performed. Socrates married a woman named Xanthippe, who later tradition portrayed as a shrewish, difficult wife, though these characterizations come from sources written long after both were dead and may reflect stereotypes more than historical reality. They had 3 sons, at least one of whom was still quite young at the time of Socrates' death. Maintaining a household and raising children required income, yet Socrates famously refused to charge fees for his conversations and philosophical activity. How he supported his family remains unclear. He may have worked as a stonemason in his younger years, or he may have received support from wealthy admirers. Ancient sources disagree on this point, with some claiming he lived in poverty and others suggesting he possessed modest but adequate resources. The crucial decision of Socrates' life came when he chose to dedicate himself entirely to philosophy. Unlike the sophists who taught for money, or the traditional teachers who instructed students in established subjects, Socrates developed an entirely different approach. He spent his days in the agora, the marketplace and public center of Athens, engaging anyone who would talk with him in conversation. He questioned politicians, craftsmen, poets, and anyone who claimed to possess knowledge or wisdom. He charged no fees, belonged to no school, wrote no books, and claimed no special expertise. Instead, he simply asked questions, examined answers, and revealed contradictions in the beliefs people held most confidently. This unusual mission would eventually bring him both devoted followers and powerful enemies. Sources used: Plato, Symposium, 219e 221b Xenophon, Memorabilia, Book I, Chapters 2-3 Diogenes Laertius, Lives of Eminent Philosophers, Book II. Pages 1832 Socrates by Robin Waterfield, pages 4067 Socrates. A Man for Our Times by Paul Johnson, pages 2851, The Cambridge Companion to Socrates, pages 17 Part 3. The Man Who Questioned Everything, the turning point in Socrates' philosophical mission, at least according to Plato's account in the Apology, came when his friend Xenophon visited the oracle at Delphi and asked whether anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle, the most respected religious authority in the Greek world, answered that no one was wiser. When Socrates heard this response, he was genuinely puzzled. He did not believe he possessed any wisdom at all. Determined to understand what the god meant, he set out to find someone wiser than himself. He approached politicians, poets, and craftsmen, people who enjoyed reputations for wisdom and knowledge. Through careful questioning, he discovered something remarkable. These supposedly wise men did not actually know what they claimed to know. They possessed opinions and beliefs, but when examined closely, their ideas fell apart into contradictions and confusion. This investigation led Socrates to a profound realization about the nature of wisdom. The oracle was correct, but not because Socrates possessed special knowledge. Rather, he was wisest because he alone recognized his own ignorance. The politicians thought they understood justice and virtue, but could not define these terms coherently. The poets created beautiful works but could not explain the meaning of their own creations. The craftsmen knew their specific trades but assumed this expertise extended to matters they had never seriously examined. Socrates, by contrast, made no such assumptions. He claimed to know only one thing, that he knew nothing. This awareness of his own ignorance made him, paradoxically, wiser than those who believed themselves knowledgeable. From this insight emerged what later generations would call the Socratic method. Socrates did not lecture or give speeches. Instead, he asked questions. He would approach someone who claimed to understand a concept like justice, courage, or piety, and ask them to define it. When they offered a definition, Socrates would examine it through further questions, looking for contradictions or implications the speaker had not considered. Almost invariably, the initial definition would prove inadequate. The conversation partner would offer a revised definition, which Socrates would examine in turn. Through this process of question and answer, called elenchus in Greek, Socrates aimed to remove false beliefs and lead people toward genuine understanding. The method appears simple, but its implications were revolutionary. Socrates believed that virtue and knowledge were intimately connected. To act justly, one must first know what justice is. To be courageous, one must understand the nature of courage. Yet most people had never seriously examined these concepts. They relied on conventional opinions, traditional sayings, and unreflective habits. Socrates insisted that this unexamined life was not worth living. Human beings possessed the capacity for reason, and they had a responsibility to use this capacity to understand the most important questions. How should one live? What is the good? What is justice? What is virtue? Central to Socrates' thinking was the belief that no one does wrong willingly. This idea seemed paradoxical to his contemporaries and remains controversial among scholars today. Socrates argued that when people act unjustly or harmfully, they do so out of ignorance. If they truly understood what was good, they would pursue it. A person who steals or lies or commits violence does so because they mistakenly believe these actions will benefit them. True knowledge of the good would make wrongdoing impossible. This view challenged the conventional Greek understanding of akrasia, or weakness of will, the idea that people sometimes knowingly choose worse actions over better ones. For Socrates, such apparent weakness was really a failure of understanding. These conversations took place not in a school or private setting, but in public spaces throughout Athens. Socrates frequented the agora, the gymnasia, and anywhere people gathered. He conversed with generals and slaves, aristocrats and craftsmen, young men and old. His discussions attracted audiences, particularly young men from wealthy families who had the leisure to spend hours listening to philosophical debates. They watched as Socrates questioned prominent citizens and revealed the emptiness of their supposed wisdom. These young followers began to imitate Socrates' method, questioning their elders and challenging traditional beliefs. To proud men of high status, this public examination was humiliating. To guardians of traditional values, the spectacle of youths learning to question authority was dangerous. Socrates described himself as a gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of Athens into awareness. He compared his method to the work of a midwife, helping others give birth to ideas rather than implanting his own doctrines. These metaphors capture something essential about his approach. He did not claim to teach truth or wisdom. He claimed only to expose ignorance and provoke genuine thinking. Whether this activity made Athens better or worse, whether it strengthened or undermined the city's values, would eventually become a question of life and death. Sources used: Plato, Apology, 20c 24b, 28e38a Plato, Theaetetus, 148e 151d Xenophon, Memorabilia, Book IV, Chapters 2-6 Socrates. Ironist and Moral Philosopher by Gregory Vlastos, pages 2144. The Cambridge Companion to Socrates, pages 145-172. Socrates by C.C.W. Taylor, pages 1852. Part 4. A philosopher in a troubled democracy. While Socrates pursued his philosophical mission, Athens descended into a catastrophic war that would destroy its empire and shake the foundations of its democracy. The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BC, pitting Athens and its allies against Sparta and the Peloponnesian League. The conflict would last 27 years and devastate the Greek world. Athens, which had seemed invincible after the Persian Wars, suffered repeated disasters. A plague struck the city in 430 BC, killing perhaps a third of the population, including Pericles himself. Military expeditions ended in defeat. The disastrous Sicilian expedition of 415–413 BC destroyed an entire Athenian fleet and army, killing or enslaving thousands of citizens. The war strained Athenian democracy to its breaking point. Political factions fought for control, generals were executed or exiled after military setbacks, and decisions made in the heat of fear or anger led to atrocities. In 416 BC, Athens massacred the male population of the neutral island of Melos and enslaved its women and children, an act that shocked even some Athenians. The democracy that had once seemed the pinnacle of human political achievement now appeared unstable and capable of terrible cruelty. Throughout these turbulent decades, Socrates continued his philosophical activities, questioning, examining, and refusing to participate in political life in conventional ways. Socrates' relationship with politics was complex and would ultimately prove fatal. He believed in obeying the laws of Athens and fulfilled his military obligations with distinction. Yet he refused to join either of the political factions that dominated Athenian public life. He did not give speeches in the assembly, did not seek office, and avoided the political maneuvering that consumed ambitious Athenians. On the rare occasions when he held public office, he demonstrated a stubborn integrity that bordered on recklessness. In 406 BC, when Socrates served on the council, the assembly voted to try 8 generals collectively for failing to recover Athenian dead after a naval victory at Arginusi. Collective trials violated Athenian law, and Socrates alone among the presiding officials refused to put the illegal motion to a vote. The assembly proceeded anyway, and 6 of the generals were executed. Shortly afterward, the Athenians regretted their decision, but by then it was too late. The end came suddenly for Athens in 404 BC, when Sparta's fleet destroyed the last Athenian naval forces at Aegispotami. The city surrendered, its walls were torn down, and its democracy was abolished. The The Spartans installed a puppet government known as the 30 Tyrants, a group of Athenian oligarchs led by Crito. What followed was a reign of terror. The 30 executed hundreds, perhaps thousands of Athenians and resident foreigners, confiscating their property and eliminating anyone they considered a threat. Many Democrats fled the city. Those who remained lived in fear. This regime lasted only 8 months, but its impact on Socrates' reputation would prove lasting and devastating. Crito, the most violent and extreme of the 30, had been a close associate of Socrates. So had Alcibiades, the brilliant but unstable Athenian general who had defected to Sparta and whose actions had contributed to Athens' defeat. Both men had spent time in Socrates' company, listening to his conversations and imitating his questioning methods. To many Athenians, the connection seemed clear. Socrates' teaching had produced these traitors and tyrants. He had corrupted the young men of Athens, turning them against democracy and traditional values. Socrates himself was not politically active during the rule of the 30, and on at least one occasion he refused their orders. When commanded to participate in the arrest of Leon of Salamis, a wealthy man the 30 intended to execute and rob, Socrates simply went home. He later said he would have been executed for this disobedience if the regime had not fallen soon afterward. When democracy was restored in 403 BC, a general amnesty was declared. Former supporters of the 30 were forgiven, and Athens attempted to heal its divisions. But suspicions and resentments remained. Many looked at Socrates and saw not an independent philosopher who had risked his life by defying tyrants, but a corrupter whose students had betrayed the city. The restored democracy was fragile and defensive. It had suffered military defeat, political upheaval, and internal violence. Its citizens were traumatized and suspicious. In this atmosphere, Socrates' habit of questioning everything, of examining and often exposing the ignorance of prominent citizens, of gathering young men and teaching them to do the same, seemed more dangerous than ever. He had been tolerated, even celebrated during Athens' confident golden age. Now, in a city nursing its wounds and fearful for its survival, his relentless questioning looked like subversion. The gadfly had stung too often. Sources used: Thucydides, The Peloponnesian War, Books VI, Xenophon, Hellenica, Book II, Chapters 3-4, Plato, Apology, 32a, 32e, The Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone, pages 80-144, Socrates by Robin Waterfield, pages 101-138, The Cambridge Companion to Socrates, pages 35-52, A History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell, pages 103-109, Part 5. The trial that changed history in 399 BC, 4 years after the restoration of democracy, 3 Athenian citizens brought formal charges against Socrates. The principal accuser was Meletus, a young poet about whom little else is known. He was joined by Anytus, a moderate democratic politician, and Lycon, a rhetorician. The indictment, which Socrates quotes in Plato's Apology, charged him with impiety and corrupting the youth. Specifically, the accusation claimed that Socrates did not believe in the gods recognized by the city, but introduced new divinities, and that he corrupted young men through his teachings. The Athenian legal system operated very differently from modern courts. There were no professional lawyers or judges. Private citizens brought charges, and cases were decided by large juries of citizens, in this case numbering 501. Both accuser and defendant spoke for themselves, presenting their cases directly to the jury. Decisions were made by majority vote, with no appeals. The system assumed that ordinary citizens possessed the wisdom to judge their peers, and that truth would emerge from hearing both sides argue their positions. Socrates' defense, preserved in Plato's Apology, stands as one of the most important documents in Western philosophy. Scholars debate how closely Plato's account reflects what Socrates actually said, but there is broad agreement that it captures the essential character of his defense, even if the specific words cannot be verified. Socrates did not beg for mercy or employ the emotional appeals common in Athenian trials. Instead, He explained his philosophical mission and defended the life he had lived. He recounted the story of the oracle at Delphi and his subsequent investigation of supposed wise men. He argued that his questioning served Athens by exposing false claims to knowledge and encouraging genuine examination of important questions. He insisted he had never intentionally corrupted anyone, and that if he had done so unintentionally, the proper response was education rather than punishment. Regarding the charge of impiety, Socrates pointed out contradictions in the accusation. Meletus claimed Socrates did not believe in gods at all, yet also charged him with introducing new divinities. Socrates questioned Meletus directly before the jury, forcing him to contradict himself. He spoke of his daemonion, a divine sign or voice that had come to him since childhood, warning him away from certain actions. This was not atheism but a form of religious experience, though one that did not fit conventional Athenian piety. He declared that he would never abandon philosophy even if acquitted, because obeying the gods' command to examine himself and others mattered more than his own life. The defense was brilliant but also provocative. Socrates refused to play the role of a humble defendant asking forgiveness. He compared himself to a gift from God, the gadfly that stung Athens into awareness. He suggested that the city should reward rather than punish him. He claimed to be the only true politician in Athens because he alone cared for the improvement of souls rather than power and wealth. These statements may have been ironic, they may have been sincere, or they may have combined both elements in ways that remain debatable. What is certain is that they did not persuade the jury. When the votes were counted, Socrates was found guilty by a margin of probably around 280 votes to 220. The verdict was not overwhelming, suggesting the jury was divided. In Athenian trials, after a guilty verdict, both the prosecution and defense proposed penalties, and the jury voted to choose between them. Meletus proposed death. Socrates, rather than proposing exile or a substantial fine that might have saved his life, initially suggested that Athens should provide him with free meals in the Prytaneum, an honor reserved for Olympic victors and great benefactors of the city. Only after friends urged him to be serious did he propose a small fine. The jury, insulted by what seemed like mockery, voted for death by a larger margin than the guilty verdict itself. Socrates could have escaped. The ancient sources make clear that the authorities would not have been displeased if he had fled into exile, sparing them the necessity of executing a famous philosopher. According to Plato's dialogue Crito, his wealthy friend Crito visited him in prison and arranged everything necessary for escape. Crito argued that Socrates had an obligation to his friends and family, that his execution would bring shame on those who failed to save him, and that exile was not dishonorable when the verdict was unjust. Socrates refused. He argued that escaping would violate the laws of Athens to which he had implicitly agreed by choosing to live there his entire life. He personified the laws themselves, imagining them asking whether his escape would not destroy them and undermine the legal system. Even an unjust verdict, rendered by a legitimate legal process, must be obeyed. To do otherwise would be to place oneself above the law and treat the city as an enemy rather than a parent. Modern scholars debate whether Socrates' reasoning in the Crito is sound, and some question whether the historical Socrates actually made these arguments or whether they represent Plato's own views. What seems clear is that Socrates chose death over exile. Whether this choice reflected absolute commitment to principle, a desire for martyrdom, concern for his philosophical legacy, or some combination of these motives cannot be determined with certainty. What mattered historically was the choice itself and how it would be remembered. Sources used: Plato, Apology, complete text Plato; Crito, complete text Xenophon, Apology of Socrates; complete text Diogenes Laertius, Lives of Eminent Philosophers, Book II, pages 40-42, The Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone, pages 145-224, Socrates by Robin Waterfield, pages 139-186, The Cambridge Companion to Socrates, pages 5371, part 6. Death and the birth of an intellectual legacy. Socrates spent his final days in prison awaiting execution. Athenian religious law prohibited executions during a sacred period when a ship traveled to and from the island of Delos, so Socrates had roughly a month between his trial and death. During this time, his friends and students visited him regularly, and these final conversations became the subject of some of the most influential philosophical writing in history. Plato's dialogue Phaedo recounts Socrates' last day and presents his final philosophical conversation. The historical accuracy of this dialogue is heavily disputed. The discussion involves complex arguments about the immortality of the soul and the nature of the afterlife that may reflect Plato's own developing philosophy more than anything the historical Socrates said. Yet the general setting is likely authentic. Socrates spent his final hours not weeping or despairing, but engaged in philosophical discussion, examining questions about death and what, if anything, lies beyond it. According to Plato's account, Socrates argued that philosophers spend their lives preparing for death by practicing the separation of soul from bodily concerns. He presented several arguments for the soul's immortality, though ancient readers disagreed about whether these arguments were meant as serious proofs or as noble myths intended to provide comfort. What seems most characteristic of Socrates is not the specific arguments but his approach, facing death as another subject for rational examination rather than surrendering to emotion. The method of execution was hemlock poison. The executioner brought Socrates a cup of the poisonous mixture, and Socrates drank it calmly after asking if he could pour a libation to the gods. He was told there was only enough for the proper dose, so he simply prayed and drank. The poison worked gradually, beginning in his feet and legs, slowly moving upward toward his heart. Socrates walked around until his legs grew heavy, then lay down as instructed. He remained conscious and conversed with those present until near the end. His last recorded words, according to Phaedo's account, were, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it." These cryptic words have been interpreted in countless ways. Asclepius was the god of healing, and sacrificing a cock to him was a traditional thanks for recovery from illness. Perhaps Socrates meant that death was a cure for life's illness. Perhaps the words had a simpler, practical meaning lost to history. No one knows with certainty. For those who witnessed it, Socrates' death was devastating. Phaedo describes the men present weeping uncontrollably, though Socrates himself remained composed and even rebuked them for their emotional displays. The loss of their teacher marked a turning point for his students and associates. Some, like Xenophon, would write memoirs defending Socrates' memory and presenting their own understanding of his teachings. Others would found philosophical schools that developed aspects of Socratic thought in different directions. The Cynics emphasized Socrates' simple lifestyle and indifference to convention. The Cyrenaics focused on pleasure and the limits of knowledge. The Megarians developed logical and metaphysical puzzles, but the most important legacy belonged to Plato. Roughly 40 years younger than Socrates, Plato had been present at the trial and had offered money toward the proposed fine. He was reportedly too ill to attend the execution, though he knew those who were present and heard their accounts. Socrates' death transformed Plato's life. He left Athens temporarily, perhaps for safety, perhaps from grief, and spent years traveling and studying. When he returned, he founded the Academy, a school that would exist for 900 years and become the model for all later universities. More importantly, Plato began writing dialogues featuring Socrates as the main character. These works, composed over many decades, preserved and transformed Socrates' ideas. Scholars divide Plato's dialogues into early, middle, and late periods. The early dialogues, like Apology, Crito, and Euthyphro, probably come closest to representing the historical Socrates method and concerns. They typically feature Socrates examining a moral concept, exposing contradictions in conventional definitions, and ending without reaching firm conclusions. The middle and late dialogues, including Republic, Phaedo, and Symposium, present increasingly complex philosophical theories that almost certainly go beyond anything the historical Socrates taught. In these works, Socrates becomes a character through whom Plato explores his own evolving ideas about forms, the ideal state, the nature of reality, and the soul's immortality. This creates what scholars call the Socratic problem. How do we distinguish the historical Socrates from Plato's literary creation? Xenophon provides an alternative account in his Memorabilia, presenting a more conventional, pious, and less intellectually radical Socrates. Aristophanes' Clouds, though a comic distortion, shows how Socrates appeared to at least some Athenian contemporaries. Aristotle, writing a generation after Socrates' death, makes references that help distinguish Socratic from Platonic doctrines. From these sources, scholars attempt to reconstruct the historical figure, though perfect certainty remains impossible. What is indisputable is that without Plato's dialogues, Socrates would be a minor footnote in the history of philosophy rather than one of its founding figures. The trial and execution transformed Socrates from a controversial Athenian figure into a universal symbol. His willingness to die rather than abandon his principles made him a model of intellectual and moral integrity. His calm acceptance of death demonstrated that philosophy was not mere abstract speculation, but a way of life with practical consequences. The image of the wise man unjustly condemned by democracy, choosing truth over safety, became one of the most powerful narratives in Western culture. Later generations would invoke Socrates whenever defending free thought against authority, individual conscience against collective pressure, or philosophical truth against political expediency. Sources used: Plato, Phaedo, Complete Text Plato, Crito, Complete Text Xenophon, Memorabilia, Book I, Chapters 1-2, Book IV, Chapter 8, Diogenes Laertius, Lives of Eminent Philosophers, Book II, pages 42-44, Socrates by Robin Waterfield, pages 187-229, The Cambridge Companion to Socrates, pages 72-89, Socrates by C.C.W. Taylor, pages 53-88, Part 7. Why Socrates still shapes the modern world. The influence of Socrates on Western philosophy cannot be overstated. Every major philosophical tradition that emerged after him either built on his ideas or defined itself in opposition to them. Through Plato, Socratic thought shaped the entire course of Western intellectual history in ways that remain visible today. Plato's academy became the intellectual center of the Greek world. There, students studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy using methods that combined Socratic questioning with systematic investigation. Among these students was Aristotle, who studied at the academy for 20 years before founding his own school, the Lyceum. Aristotle both built upon and departed from Socratic and Platonic philosophy, developing a comprehensive system that encompassed logic, ethics, politics, metaphysics, and natural science. His works preserved Socratic insights about the importance of definition, the connection between knowledge and virtue, and the value of systematic inquiry, while rejecting some Platonic doctrines he traced to Socrates. The Hellenistic philosophical schools that emerged after Aristotle all claimed connection to Socrates. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium, admired Socrates as a model of virtue and self-control. They developed his ideas about the connection between knowledge and right action into a comprehensive ethical system focused on living according to nature and reason. The Epicureans, despite pursuing pleasure rather than Socratic virtue, respected his commitment to philosophical inquiry and his calm acceptance of death. The skeptics built on Socratic claims of ignorance, developing sophisticated arguments about the limits of human knowledge. When Rome conquered the Greek world, it absorbed Greek philosophy along with Greek culture. Roman thinkers like Cicero and Seneca studied Socrates through Plato's dialogues and Xenophon's memoirs. They admired his moral courage and presented him as a model of the philosophical life. Seneca, facing execution under Nero, consciously imitated Socrates' calm acceptance of death. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, repeatedly invoked Socratic ideas about self-examination and the examined life. The rise of Christianity created complex engagement with Socratic thought. Early Christian apologists saw Socrates as a righteous pagan who, despite lacking biblical revelation, had lived according to reason and virtue. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century called Socrates a Christian before Christ, arguing that the divine logos that became incarnate in Jesus had also worked through Socrates. Augustine and other church fathers studied Plato's dialogues and incorporated Socratic methods of questioning and dialectical reasoning into Christian theology. The image of Socrates choosing death rather than abandoning truth paralleled Christian martyrs choosing death rather than denying their faith. Islamic philosophers encountered Socrates through translations of Plato and Aristotle. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna engaged with Socratic ideas about knowledge, virtue, and the examined life, integrating them into Islamic philosophical and theological frameworks. Through these Islamic scholars, Socratic thought was preserved and transmitted back to medieval Europe, where it had been partially lost. The rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance brought renewed attention to Socrates. Humanist scholars studied Plato's dialogues in Greek and emphasized Socratic values of individual moral development through education and rational inquiry. Erasmus and other Renaissance thinkers saw Socrates as a model of the independent intellectual questioning, received dogma, and pursuing truth wherever it led. The Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries claimed Socrates as an ancestor of their project. Voltaire invoked Socrates when attacking religious intolerance and defending freedom of thought. Rousseau admired his simple lifestyle and independence from social conventions. Kant described his own critical philosophy as bringing Socratic questioning to epistemology and metaphysics. The Enlightenment ideal of the autonomous individual, using reason to question authority and discover truth, owed much to the Socratic model. Modern education systems reflect Socratic influence in their emphasis on questioning, critical thinking, and dialogue. The Socratic method, adapted and modified, remains a teaching technique in law schools, philosophy departments, and other educational settings. The idea that education should develop the capacity for independent thought rather than simply transmitting information traces back to Socrates' insistence that he taught nothing, but merely helped others discover truth for themselves. In ethics, Socratic questions remain central. What is justice? What is virtue? How should one live? These questions, which Socrates pursued through the streets of Athens, continue to drive moral philosophy. His conviction that the unexamined life is not worth living underpins the assumption that ethical beliefs should be rationally justified rather than blindly accepted. His connection between knowledge and virtue, though controversial, influenced countless later ethical theories. The modern conception of the intellectual as someone who questions authority, pursues truth regardless of consequences, and speaks uncomfortable truths to power owes much to the Socratic model. Whenever someone defends free inquiry against political or religious authority, they implicitly invoke the figure of Socrates facing the Athenian jury. His trial has been endlessly analyzed as a case study in the tension between individual conscience and collective authority, between freedom of thought and social stability. Yet Socrates' legacy is not simple or uniformly positive. His execution has been used to indict democracy as mob rule that suppresses wisdom and virtue. His apparent elitism, his association with oligarchs like Crito, and his questioning of democratic procedures have made him a contested figure in political philosophy. Some defenders of democracy, including the journalist I.F. Stone in his controversial book The Trial of Socrates, argue that Athens had legitimate reasons to fear Socrates, and that his execution, while tragic, was not simply irrational persecution. Modern scholars debate whether Socrates was primarily a moral philosopher focused on ethics, or whether he also made contributions to epistemology, metaphysics, and other areas later developed by Plato. They disagree about whether his claim to know nothing was sincere or ironic, whether his arguments were meant to reach genuine conclusions or simply to expose false beliefs, and whether his philosophical method could actually produce knowledge or only remove ignorance. These debates demonstrate that Socrates remains a living presence in philosophy rather than a historical monument. What remains indisputable is that a stonemason's son who wrote nothing, founded no school, and was executed as a criminal became one of the most influential thinkers in human history. He achieved this through the force of his personality, the power of his questions, and the example of his life and death. He showed that philosophical inquiry was not mere abstract speculation, but a transformative activity that could change how people understood themselves and their world. He demonstrated that commitment to truth could matter more than life itself, and he established questioning, dialogue, and rational examination as essential tools for pursuing wisdom. 2.5 millennia after his death, Socrates' voice still echoes through Western culture. Every time someone asks for a definition, examines hidden assumptions, or pursues an argument wherever it leads, they practice a method Socrates developed. Every time someone invokes individual conscience against collective pressure, they implicitly draw on Socratic precedent. Every time a teacher asks questions rather than simply providing answers, they employ a Socratic technique. The man who claimed to know nothing taught humanity how to think. Sources used: The Cambridge Companion to Socrates, pages 323-378, A History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell, pages 119-134. Socrates, A Man for Our Times by Paul Johnson, pages 140-189. Socrates, Ironist and Moral Philosopher by Gregory Vlastos, pages 120. The Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone, pages 225-254. The Oxford Companion to Philosophy, 2nd edition, Entries on Socrates and Socratic Method, pages 880-885. Socrates by Robin Waterfield, pages 230-267.